birth of a pilot. Kenneth Collier was born in 1922 in a small village in southern England. From an early age, he was fascinated by airplanes. While other children played with dolls or balls, Kenneth built model aircraft and read books about the aerial battles of the First World War. When the Second World War began, his passion for flying became more than a hobby. It was an opportunity to serve his country. At the age of 18, he applied to the Royal Air Force and was soon sent for fighter pilot training. Every day of training was a challenge. Collier learned to take off and land on wooden airfields, maneuver in tight spaces, and cope with sudden engine failures. His instructors quickly noticed his extraordinary spatial awareness and calmness under stress. With the start of combat operations, he was assigned to Squadron 91, where pilots were preparing to face a new threat, the German V-1 rockets, known as flying bombs. These dangerous machines brought destruction to the heart of London, and for the Royal Air Force, every victory against them was critically important. June 1944. Only days after the Allied landings in Normandy, London was once again a city under attack. Not from bombers this time, but from something new, something faster, deadlier, and inhuman. The Germans called it the Vergeltungswaffe 1, the Vengeance Weapon 1. To the British, it became known simply as the V-1 flying bomb or the Doodlebug. Launched from the French coast, each V-1 carried nearly a ton of explosives and roared toward London at over 600 kilometers per hour. Its engine made a distinct buzzing sound, and when that sound stopped, people knew it was too late. Moments later came the explosion. By mid-June, hundreds of these pilotless bombs were falling over southern England every day. Thousands were killed. The RAF scrambled to find a way to stop them. Anti-aircraft guns were moved to the coast, barrage balloons were raised, and fighter pilots were ordered to intercept the V-1s before they reached the capital. Among those pilots was Flying Officer Kenneth Collier of No. 91 Squadron, based at RAF Westmalling in Kent. He flew the new Supermarine Spitfire Mk-14, one of the few aircraft fast enough to catch the V-1 in flight. The orders were clear: intercept and destroy. But it was far from easy. The V-1s flew low just above the treetops and at nearly full throttle. Shooting one down risked detonating its warhead at close range. Yet these young men flew daily, often alone, chasing mechanical bombs across the English countryside to protect the sleeping millions in London. As Collier later recalled, "You didn't think about danger. You only thought, if I miss it, that bomb reaches a street full of children." The RAF called it the anti-diver campaign. To the pilots, it was a race against time. Each V-1 was launched from ramps hidden in the forests of northern France. Once airborne, it followed a preset course to London: no pilot, no mercy. British radar tracked them as they crossed the Channel, and control stations scrambled fighters from the nearest airfields. Collier's squadron took off at dawn almost every day. The Spitfire's Griffin engine roared through the Kentish skies as pilots hunted the incoming dots on the radar screens. The moment they spotted a V-1, the chase began. The tactic was dangerous. Approach from behind, fire short bursts at the engine or wing root, and pull away before the explosion. But there was another, far more daring method: the wingtip technique. Some pilots discovered that by flying alongside a V-1 and gently placing their wing under the bomb's stubby wing, they could flip the missile off balance. The V-1's primitive gyroscope would lose control, sending it crashing harmlessly into a field below. Collier had practiced this maneuver several times in training. But doing it for real with a live flying bomb required absolute precision. On the evening of July 7, 1944, as the sun set over the English Channel, radar picked up another wave of V-1s heading for London. Collier and two other pilots were scrambled from Westmalling. The sky was streaked with the orange glow of anti-aircraft fire. Collier climbed to 5,000 feet, turned south, and spotted the trail of a buzzing black dot racing toward the capital. He pushed the throttle forward. The Spitfire's engine howled. Within minutes, Collier was behind the V-1. The missile weaved slightly, the pulse jet roaring like a chainsaw. He closed the distance: 600 yards, 400, 200. He squeezed the trigger, firing short bursts. Tracers struck the V-1's fuselage but missed the engine. The bomb continued straight ahead, unshaken. At that range, one more burst could detonate it and take him with it. For a brief moment, Collier hesitated. He could break off and let the anti-aircraft guns try their luck. But London lay only minutes away. The missile's course was perfect, straight toward the city. He pulled alongside, leveling his wings with the V-1. The air trembled between them. The Spitfire's right wingtip hovered just inches beneath the bomb's left wing. One wrong move and both aircraft would disintegrate. He eased closer. The airflow caught the V-1's wing. A sudden jolt, then a violent roll. The bomb flipped sideways, lost balance, and plunged earthward in a spiral of fire. Seconds later, a dull explosion blossomed far below, over open fields of Kent. Collier pulled up sharply. His Spitfire shuddered. A fragment of the blast had torn into his wing. Fuel leaked. Controls stiffened. He managed to level out and radio his base. Target destroyed. Returning home. If I can. He landed barely intact. Ground crews counted the holes in his aircraft and stared in disbelief. He had risked everything not by shooting but by touching wings with a flying bomb. That night, while London slept peacefully, one street, perhaps hundreds of lives, had been spared. The vengeance weapons. By the summer of 1944, the German vengeance campaign had become one of the greatest threats Britain had faced since the Blitz. Each V-1 carried an 850-kilogram warhead, enough to destroy a street of houses. Hundreds were being launched daily from the Pas-de-Calais. At first, Londoners called them buzz bombs. The sound of the pulse jet, a rhythmic drone that echoed through the night, became the most dreaded sound in England. When the engine stopped, there were just seconds to find cover. Winston Churchill himself described the V-1 assault as a new chapter in the art of cruelty. In response, the British mobilized the entire southeastern defense network. The Royal Artillery formed Operation Diver, named after the code word for incoming V-1s. Anti-aircraft guns were moved closer to the coast, radar stations worked around the clock, and entire squadrons were reassigned to intercept duty. Among these, No. 91 Squadron at West Malling became one of the most effective. Flying Spitfire MKXIVs, powered by the new Griffin engine, they could reach speeds over 720 kilometers per hour, just enough to chase a V-1 in level flight. Pilots like Kenneth Collier, Joseph Barry, and Roland Beaumont flew up to 6 sorties a day. Exhaustion and danger were constant companions. They called themselves the Anti-Buzz Boys. Each kill was a small victory, a single bomb less over London. But the cost was high. Many pilots were lost, their aircraft destroyed by the very explosions they caused. Still, morale remained unbroken. They knew the stakes. The fate of London rested in their hands, and every interception meant lives saved below. The edge of the sky. July 14, 1944. The morning sun burned away the mist over Kent. Collier sat in his cockpit, the engine idling, waiting for the order to scramble. His flight leader, Squadron Leader Barry, briefed the pilots. Radar had detected a formation of V-1s crossing the channel. Intercept at 10,000 feet. Engage individually. Watch your spacing, one hit could set off the next. Moments later, the siren wailed. The Spitfires rolled down the grass runway, engines roaring in unison. Within minutes, they were airborne, climbing into the blue. The radio crackled. Diver, diver, Dover sector. Multiple targets. Heading 310 degrees. Collier banked west, scanning the horizon. Then he saw it. A black speck trailing smoke, racing across the countryside. He dove after it, the Spitfire screaming through the air. At 400 miles per hour, the chase was pure instinct. The V-1 rocked in turbulence, its pulse jet spitting flames. Collier lined up his sights, fired, the round struck home. A flash, a burst of fire, and then a violent shockwave. Fragments peppered his windscreen. The blast nearly tore the tail from his aircraft. He steadied the Spitfire, heart pounding, as debris rained from the sky. When he returned to base, ground crews counted their kills. Barry had destroyed for that morning. Collier, 1 confirmed. Over London, that meant 5 fewer bombs and possibly hundreds fewer dead. That evening, the pilots gathered in the mess. Their faces were drawn, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. Outside, thunder echoed, or perhaps another V1 falling. "Someday," Collier said quietly, "someone will invent a bomb that never misses, and then none of this will matter." Barry looked at him and replied, "Until that day, we'll keep flying." The night of fire. By late July, the V1 campaign reached its peak. Over 2,000 bombs had struck southern England. Entire neighborhoods in London lay in ruins. Yet morale, remarkably, did not break. The British press called it the Second Battle of Britain. And like the first, it was being fought by a handful of young men with wings of aluminum and hearts of steel. On the night of July 21st, Collier was scrambled for an emergency intercept. A single V1 had slipped through the coastal guns and was heading straight for the capital. The weather was terrible, rain and low cloud. Radar tracking was uncertain. Collier climbed through the storm, his cockpit buffeted by turbulence. Lightning flashed across the horizon. Then, through a break in the clouds, he saw it, the faint orange pulse of a V1 engine. He dove in pursuit, but the wind was savage. His instruments danced wildly. Below him lay the dark outline of the Thames estuary, and beyond it, London. He fired twice, missing both times. The rain blurred his vision. The V1 continued unshaken, the glow of its engine flickering like a ghost over the rooftops. At that moment, Collier made his choice. He closed the throttle, eased alongside the missile, and once again tried the wingtip maneuver. The buffeting was worse than ever. Twice he nearly collided. But on the third attempt, the airflow caught the V1's wing, flipping it violently. The missile spiraled down, disappearing into the darkness. A few seconds later, a flash lit the clouds below. The explosion echoed like thunder. Collier's aircraft shuddered, alarms flashing. He had flown directly through the shockwave. His engine sputtered, but held. He turned for home. That night, reports came in. No V1 had reached London. The people slept through the storm, unaware of how close death had passed overhead. The toll of the sky. By early August 1944, Britain was fighting exhaustion as much as the enemy. The V1 attacks had been relentless. More than 6,000 flying bombs had been launched since June. London's East End, still recovering from the Blitz, was again scarred by fire and ruin. The RAF pilots bore the weight of that reality every day. For men like Kenneth Collier, sleep came in snatches. Missions blurred into each other. Some mornings, the airfields were silent, a reminder of those who hadn't returned the night before. The official reports were cold numbers. 1 aircraft lost, pilot missing. But on the ground, those words meant an empty chair in the mess, a cup left untouched, a locker never opened again. Still, Collier kept flying. He was now credited with 12 confirmed V1 kills, making him one of the squadron's top interceptors. But he never spoke of it. "You don't count victories," he said. "You count the ones that got through." In early August, the pilots began noticing fewer launches. Rumors spread that Allied troops advancing through France were overrunning the German launch sites. The end of the V1 threat might be near. But for the men of 91 Squadron, the danger wasn't over yet. The Germans still held the northern coast. Every night, new ramps appeared. Every morning, new bombs took flight. The battle for London's survival continued, and so did Collier's quiet war in the skies. The last sortie. August 16, 1944. The dawn was calm over Kent. A light mist hung over the airfield as Collier walked to his Spitfire, helmet in hand. Ground crewmen nodded as he passed. No one spoke much that morning. Orders had come down for one last sweep. Radar had detected a handful of stragglers. V1s still being launched from hidden ramps near the French coast. Collier was assigned as wingman to Flight Lieutenant Joseph Barry, by then the highest-scoring diver-killer in the RAF. They took off just after sunrise. The English Channel shimmered beneath them, dotted with the shadows of Allied ships heading to France. The war was turning. But even in victory, death waited for the careless. As they approached the coast, Barry spotted a V1 racing inland. "Contact! Diver ahead, engaging!" he called over the radio. Both Spitfires dove. The chase began, a deadly race against time and speed. Collier lined up behind the bomb. His guns jammed after the first burst. Swearing, he switched to Plan B, the wingtip maneuver. He eased his Spitfire closer, the air roaring around him. The V-1 jolted in the turbulence, its guidance system struggling to stay level. At the perfect moment, Collier nudged his right wing beneath the bomb's left fin and tipped it. The missile flipped over and exploded in midair. The blast wave hit him head-on. For a moment, the sky vanished in fire. His aircraft rolled violently, smoke filling the cockpit. He managed to level out, but his engine was failing. Flames licked the fuselage. "Barry, I'm hit. Going down." Those were his last words over the radio. Witnesses saw his Spitfire trailing smoke as it descended through the clouds. It struck the ground near the village of Frant, just south of Tunbridge Wells. The explosion shook the nearby woods. Kenneth Collier was 24 years old. Silence over Kent. When the recovery team reached the crash site, there was little left of the aircraft. The V-1 debris lay scattered across the fields, a grim reminder of the war's strange symmetry. One flying bomb destroying another. At West Malling, the squadron fell silent. Barry, his voice cracking, filed the report himself. Flying Officer Collier destroyed one V-1 and was lost in the explosion. By the end of August, the V-1 threat to London had effectively ended. The Allied advance through northern France had captured nearly all the launch sites. The last V-1 struck London on September 7th. For the people of Britain, it marked the end of one nightmare, but at a cost measured not in numbers, but in names. Collier's name was later inscribed on the RAF memorial at Runnymede, among hundreds of pilots who had no known grave. His squadron mates often spoke of him in the present tense, as though he were still out there, chasing another black shadow across the sky. One of them later said, "He didn't die to destroy a machine. He died to save a city." And indeed, for every V-1 brought down, there was a street that never burned, a family that never perished, a child who lived to see peace. The sound of the doodlebug would fade into memory, but the courage of men like Kenneth Collier would echo for generations. The end of the doodlebug summer. By late August 1944, the skies over southern England had grown strangely quiet. For the first time in months, the nights were no longer broken by the drone of the buzz bomb. Londoners, still wary of false hope, began to sleep with their windows open again. The newspapers called it the end of the doodlebug summer. More than 6,000 V-1 rockets had been launched against Britain since June. Around 2,400 had reached London. But thanks to the RAF anti-aircraft gunners and balloon crews, over half were destroyed in flight. It had been a grim, desperate victory, one fought not in grand offensives, but in lonely duels high above the English countryside. At RAF West Malling, the surviving pilots gathered for a final group photograph. They stood in front of their battered Spitfires, some smiling, others staring into the distance. In the back row, there was a gap where Kenneth Collier would have stood. Flight Lieutenant Joseph Barry, now the top-scoring V-1 killer with 60 destroyed, insisted that Collier's name be included in the squadron's official victory list. "His last act saved hundreds," Barry said. "He deserves to be remembered." In London, the people never knew his name, but somewhere between the blackout curtains and the bomb shelters, a mother tucked her children into bed that night, unaware that her city still stood because a young pilot had given his life above the clouds. A new shadow, the V-2. Just as Britain began to breathe again, a new sound filled the air, the sound of nothing. On September 8, 1944, a sudden explosion tore through the Chiswick district of West London. There had been no siren, no warning, no engine noise. In an instant, 13 people were dead, 20 injured. It was the first strike of a new weapon, the V-2 rocket. Unlike the V-1, it traveled faster than sound, invisible, unstoppable. There would be no interception, no heroic chase in the sky. For the RAF, it was a bitter realization. The men who had risked their lives to stop the V-1S now watched helplessly as the V-2S rained down. This time, the war had leapt beyond the reach of wings. But the lessons of the V-1 campaign were not lost. The The success of the Tempest and Spitfire squadrons proved that courage and ingenuity could counter even the most terrifying innovations of war. And for those who remembered Kenneth Collier and others like him, their sacrifice had bought Britain time to invade Europe, time to turn the tide. When Londoners heard the V2 explosions, they no longer panicked. They endured as they always had, because they knew, behind every silence, behind every saved street, there was already a story of courage written in the sky. The letter home. In October 1944, 2 months after the crash, a letter arrived at a modest home in Surrey. It was addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Collier. The envelope bore the crest of the Royal Air Force. Inside, the letter was brief, official, dignified, and unbearably final. Dear Mrs. Collier, it is with deep regret that I must confirm your son, Flying Officer Kenneth Collier, is presumed to have lost his life in action on August 16, 1944, while intercepting an enemy flying bomb. His courage and devotion to duty reflect the highest traditions of the Royal Air Force. Please accept the sincere sympathy of His Majesty's government. A second letter arrived a few days later, handwritten in ink. It was from Flight Lieutenant Joseph Barry. He died as he lived, calmly, with purpose. He saved lives that day. We will never forget him. Eleanor placed the letters in a wooden box beside Kenneth's childhood photograph. For her, the war never truly ended. Each evening she would listen to the distant hum of aircraft over England and imagine that one of them was her son. Still flying, still watching over the city he had saved. In the official records, his final sortie was summarized in just one line. 1v1 destroyed. Pilot missing. But for those who understood what that meant, it was the story of London's survival written in a single sentence. The turning tide. By autumn 1944, the tide of war had turned irrevocably in favor of the Allies. In France, the liberation of Paris had electrified Europe. In Belgium and Holland, Allied troops were pressing toward Germany itself. But even as victory drew closer, the cost continued to mount. The men of the RAF, those who had survived the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, and now the V1 campaign, were exhausted. Many had flown since 1940, living on adrenaline, black coffee, and duty. At RAF West Malling, the remaining Tempest pilots prepared for new missions over the continent. Flight Lieutenant Barry led several of these sorties, strikes on retreating German convoys, airfields, and rail lines. But to those who knew him, something had changed. He no longer celebrated his victories. In his diary, Barry wrote, "Collier's gone. So many gone. Each victory seems smaller now, each loss larger." On October 2, 1944, just weeks after writing those words, Barry himself was killed in action over Holland. His Tempest was hit by flak. He never bailed out. When the news reached West Malling, the men stood in silence. The two top V1 hunters, Barry and Collier, were gone. But together they had saved untold thousands. Their absence left a void that no medal or memorial could ever fill. London in peace. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Crowds flooded Trafalgar Square, singing, laughing, crying. Church bells rang across a city that had survived fire, bombs, and fear itself. But for many Londoners, celebration came with a quiet moment of remembrance. In the East End, people gathered outside churches where names of the fallen had been pinned to wooden boards. Somewhere among those names was Flying Officer K. Collier. Children played in streets that months earlier had been littered with debris from the doodlebugs. In Hyde Park, lovers walked where barrage balloons once floated. The war had ended, but its echoes lingered in every brick, every scar, every silence after the sirens. The RAF disbanded many of its wartime squadrons. Pilots returned home to ordinary lives. Farmers, teachers, mechanics, husbands. But those who had fought the battle of the flying bombs carried memories they never spoke of. At reunions years later, they would raise a glass to those who didn't come back. And always someone would whisper Collier's name. He had become a symbol, not just of bravery, but of the quiet, unrecorded heroism that had saved Britain from annihilation. The forgotten hero. In the decades after the war, history turned its gaze to grander stories. D-Day, Arnhem, Berlin. The lonely duels against the V-1S were largely forgotten, buried in archives and footnotes. But for those who had lived through that summer, the sound of the V1 was unforgettable. Elderly Londoners would recall how they froze at the moment the engine cut out, waiting for the explosion that might never come. And in those stories, there was always a mention of the young pilots who knocked them from the sky. No one remembered all their names, but the spirit of men like Kenneth Collier endured in the city's memory. In 1960, a small memorial was placed near the village of Frant, close to the site of Collier's crash. It bore a simple inscription, "In memory of Flying Officer Kenneth Collier, RAF, who gave his life intercepting a V-1 flying bomb. August 16, 1944. He died so that others might live." Few visited the site. The field had grown over with grass, the sound of engines replaced by birdsong. But for those who stumbled upon it, the words carried weight, because they told, in just a few lines, the story of one man's courage, and the day he changed the fate of a city. The jet age and the ghosts of the past. The years after the war brought a new dawn for aviation. By the early 1950s, Britain's skies were no longer filled with Spitfires and Tempests, but with the sleek silver shapes of meteors and vampires, the first jet fighters. The world had moved on, yet the pilots of the war years carried ghosts that jets could not chase away. Many instructors at RAF bases were veterans of 1940 to 44, men who had once fought the V-1S. In the mess halls, over late-night cups of tea, young jet pilots would listen as the older men spoke quietly about those days. One of them, a flight instructor named Squadron Leader Peter Linton, had flown alongside Collier during the V-1 campaign. When asked about him, Linton would always pause before answering. "You know," he once said, "he wasn't trying to be a hero. He just did what needed doing. That's what we all did. Only difference is, some of us came back." As Britain entered the jet age, those words became a quiet creed of the Royal Air Force. Technology changed. The enemies changed. But the principle remained the same: duty above self. And though Collier's name faded from the headlines, his story lingered in the classrooms and briefing rooms of the RAF. Because every young pilot who took to the sky knew that their freedom to fly had been bought by men like him. The historian's discovery. In 1978, nearly 34 years after the end of the war, an aviation historian named Dr. Malcolm Fenton began researching the V-1 campaign for a new book. His goal was to document the pilots who had intercepted the flying bombs, an effort long overlooked by mainstream historians. While combing through the National Archives, he stumbled upon a thin folder labeled 91 Squadron, August 1944. Inside, he found a single-page combat report written in fading ink. Flying Officer K. Collier engaged one enemy flying bomb over Kent, August 16, 1944. Guns malfunctioned. Pilot attempted interception by wingtip contact. Enemy flying bomb destroyed. Pilot lost in explosion. Dr. Fenton sat back in silence. The entry was brief, but it was extraordinary. This was no mechanical failure or accident. It was an act of deliberate self-sacrifice. He began tracking down survivors from 91 Squadron, men now in their 50s and 60s. Through interviews, letters, and diaries, he pieced together Collier's final flight. The more he learned, the more he realized how narrow the line between victory and tragedy had been that morning in 1944. When Fenton's book, Defenders of the Realm, The Battle Against the Flying Bombs, was published in 1980, it included a full chapter on Kenneth Collier. For the first time, his name was spoken publicly, not as a statistic but as a man. The book's release sparked renewed interest in the forgotten air war over Britain. Television producers, journalists, and museums reached out, searching for more. And slowly, the story of a single pilot who crashed into a flying bomb to save London began to echo once more through the nation's memory. The Voice from the Archive. In 1994, to mark the 50th anniversary of D-Day and the V-1 campaign, the BBC produced a documentary titled The Summer of the Doodlebugs. Among the archival recordings unearthed for the film was a fragment of audio, a brief radio exchange between two Spitfire pilots, believed to be from 91 Squadron. The transmission crackled with static. Then silence. Experts believed it was the final transmission from Kenneth Collier. The BBC played the clip near the end of the documentary, overlaying it with the sound of wind and the slow toll of church bells. When the program aired, viewers across Britain sat in stunned silence. For many, it was the first time they had heard, not read, the real voices of the young men who defended them half a century earlier. Letters poured into the network. One, written in careful handwriting from an elderly woman in Surrey, said simply, "I heard his voice tonight, my Kenneth. After 50 years, I finally heard him again." It was signed Eleanor Collier. Remembering a hero. By the turn of the 21st century, the story of Kenneth Collier had become part of a broader effort to honor the pilots who defended Britain during the V1 campaign. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of the first V1 attacks, the Imperial War Museum in London hosted a special exhibition titled Diver, the Battle Against the Flying Bombs. Among the artifacts were Spitfire parts, anti-aircraft gun fragments, and diaries from 91 Squadron. A corner of the exhibition was dedicated to Collier. There, visitors could see his flying logbooks, letters to his family, and photographs of a young man with determined eyes staring into the lens of history. A short film narrated by surviving squadron members told the story of that August morning in 1944, the precise moment when a single decision by a single pilot altered the fate of countless Londoners. School children visiting the exhibition were often struck silent. Teachers would pause, allowing the weight of the story to sink in. One man, one Spitfire, one moment of courage, and an entire city spared from destruction. Veterans of the squadron, now in their 70s and 80s, would sometimes attend in person. One remarked quietly, "We all knew the risks, but none of us thought of it as heroism. Kenneth, he just went further than any of us could imagine." Memorial services began to include his name alongside the countless others who had given their lives to protect Britain. From plaques in small village churches to RAF airfields, the memory of Kenneth Collier endured, not as a story of tragedy, but as a testament to courage and selfless duty. Legacy of the sky. Today, the skies over London are quiet. Modern jets and satellites patrol a world far removed from the terror of the V1 campaign. Yet the legacy of pilots like Collier lives on. RAF training programs teach young pilots not only the mechanics of flight but also the history of those who came before. Squadrons still recount the stories of Spitfires engaging the Doodlebugs, emphasizing decision-making under extreme pressure, courage in the face of fear, and the understanding that one act can save thousands. Museums continue to preserve artifacts, and documentaries like the one you're now hearing bring the story to audiences worldwide. Every time a visitor reads Collier's name, watches archival footage, or listens to the crackling voice over the radio, they are reminded that history is more than dates and battles. It is made by ordinary people who perform extraordinary acts. Kenneth Collier's decision to intercept a V1 with his Spitfire was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a profound choice to protect life over self. It remains a powerful example of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. A story that inspires pilots, historians, and ordinary people alike. As the camera pans over the London skyline, now peaceful and bright, the narration concludes. In one moment of daring, one young pilot changed the course of history. He gave his life so others might live. And in that act, Kenneth Collier became eternal, a hero of the skies, remembered by a grateful nation forever. Fade to black. End credits roll with archival footage of Spitfires, London during the Blitz, and memorials honoring those who defended the city.